Hello and welcome to this guest lecture on the online Master in Interaction Design of the Cyprus University of Technology. My name is LENNART Nacke and I'm an associate professor at the University of Waterloo. I am the director of the HCI Games Group there, and I work at the Games Institute and the Department of Drama and Speech Communication. My expertise is in game design, and today I will talk to you a little bit about what makes game design. I'll give you a brief introduction of game design. So thank you very much for following me through this lecture. I'll try to give you some examples for how this is relevant to your careers as interaction designers. So first of all, when we talk about game design, we need to understand what games are. And there are lots of different definitions of games out there, but one definition that sticks out is that a game is really a system in which players engage in an artificial conflict which is defined by rules that results in a quantifiable, usually a variable outcome. Okay, so if we try and break down that definition into its different factors, it gives us an idea of the elements that we find in video games and other types of games. The key elements of the definition are, for example, first of all, the fact that we're talking about a system. Every game is a system, and as interaction designers, you're also system designers. So you have to think about what it means to build systems that are interactive. Now, in every system, we have entities that interact. In a game system, we have players that are interacting with the system, but we also have objects and other bits in that game system that create conflict. And this is interesting because as user experience designers, we usually have the task of reducing the friction in any interactive system. We're trying to make things more usable. We're trying to make things more effortless, the way that we engage with them. However, when we're building games, we're actually trying to increase the friction in the interaction. We're trying to make things a little bit more difficult so that we feel a sense of achievement when we overcome these things in games. So oftentimes we're introducing something called a conflict, and the conflict in games is artificial, right? We have rules that we introduce that tell you, for example, you can't do this or you can't do that, but you can do other things. And when you do these things, it can enhance your interaction with something. So you're limiting player behavior with those rules and you're creating that kind of conflict. So every game then results in some sort of outcome that you have at the end. And that outcome is quantifiable usually. It tells you, one person is better than another person, so you have oftentimes some sort of leaderboard, or you've got some sort of scoring mechanism, or you have a way of leveling up your character or your person, and it just makes for a very engaging and an exciting way to create new skills and learn new abilities. So when we're looking at games as systems, we also have to understand that games have boundaries to the outside world. Oftentimes the things that you do in a game are not transferable directly to what happens on the outside world. And this is really just talking about games plainly as games, and we're talking about video games and other things. We're not so much talking about, serious games, gamification, and all these other applications where we're trying to build things that actually transcend into real life. In video games and games for the purpose of entertaining people, we're really talking about something like a magic circle. The magic circle is a boundary that makes this game space exist as a subset of reality that follows its own rules. So essentially by entering that magic circle, you're agreeing to be bound by those rules. What happens if you don't abide by those rules? Well, you're cheating. That's what happens. So usually when you're entering the magic circle, you have to decide this applies to me and then I'm playing the game. And if it doesn't apply to you, well, then you're called a cheater. You're not actually following what happens in the game world. And in the game world, we essentially have 4 entities that make up that game world, that game system. We've got objects, we have attributes, we have internal relationships, and we have the environment within which it all takes place. So the objects are essentially the things that you create in a game that actually make the game tick. And each of the object has some sort of attribute. I mean, this is taken directly straight out of system theory. You're building a system that has these objects and the attributes, but then the objects and attributes have a relationship with one another, and you can influence that relationship by interacting with those objects. And then whatever happens will affect the environment that you're in. And usually games can operate within formal, experiential, and cultural systems, but games are also a system of their own. So whenever you're influencing these objects and the properties and the attributes, then you're building an interaction in the game space. Now, we can talk about two types of elements in games. We've got formal elements and dramatic elements in games. First, I will talk about the formal elements in games. As formal elements, we have players, we have objectives, we've got procedures, we have rules, we have resources, we have conflict, we have boundaries, and we have outcomes. Okay, so let's try to get a better idea of what these elements mean. The first of all is players. Now, players are essentially the actors that you have in the game world. Now, players can all align with a goal, a common goal, such as if you play Pandemic or other collaborative games. Everyone is trying to achieve the same goal, and the outcome is beneficial for all players. Or players can be in conflict to each other in a game. That means one player has a goal that's arbitrary to another player's goal, and they're engaging in that form of conflict. So whenever you're designing a game, the first thing you have to think about is, what are my players doing in that game? And what is the conflict I'm creating for those players? Next, we have objectives. That means to create some sort of interesting conflict that we'll talk about later, you'll have to set objectives. You'll have to tell the players, you have to do this or you have to do that in the game to achieve a certain outcome. Well, that's great. Objectives guide player behavior. Objectives guide players through that net, through that weave of objects and properties and the relationships between those objects and properties. Well, objectives help you find your way through there. But then the way that you find that way through this web of a system of a game is essentially procedures. Procedures are essentially telling you what is happening at each step of the way. That means if I'm on this square, for example, if it's a board game, I can take this action. If I continue to go here, then I do the next action. And the guidelines for these procedures are then called rules. Rules are the framework within which those procedures operate. Rules tell you you're allowed to do something or you're not allowed to do something. They constrain your actions, by that creating conflict and other things in games. But rules are essential to games. Next, we have resources. Resources are the bits that we find in a game that allow you to level up your character. They allow you to get rewards for a certain action. They allow you to build something like an economy in a game that allows you to trade things and interact with other players. Resources are essential for the exchange of players within the game or of players and other objects in the game, and to influence the relationship that we have between those objects. So conflict is another one of these options that we have in the game, and I've already talked about conflict quite a bit. Conflict is essentially an arbitrary goal between different players that we have. So sometimes, there are players that want to do something that is contrary to what the other player wants to do. And by giving those players goals that are in conflict with one another, the actions that come out of the player interaction with the game create a conflict within the game world. Then we have something called boundaries. Boundaries are essentially the limitations of the world within which you operate. If you think about something like soccer or tennis, these games operate within a court or within a playing field, and whenever you leave the boundary of that playing field, the rules don't apply to you anymore. So it is important within games to have these spaces within which you have a special power or within which the game rules apply, so that you know where the game is happening and where the game is not happening. And finally, there's something called the outcome. And the outcome should often be variable and negotiable. It shouldn't be something that influences your life after all. This is something that should just be temporary and just for the game world. So that later you can then move on and do other things outside of the game. The next step that I want to talk about is dramatic elements. Now, dramatic elements, in comparison to formal elements that I talked about before, are things that really help raise the tension for a video game. So we've got challenge, we've got play, we've got premise, we've got character, and we've got story. So first of all, challenge. Challenge is a sense of accomplishment and enjoyment that you often find in games, and is determined by the skills and the abilities that the player has. So it can be something that's individualized, can be something that's dynamic. Oftentimes you have games that really cater towards a certain type of skill that a player has, but they also train a new skill that a player didn't have before. So if we quote Ralph Koster in his book, A Theory of Fun in Video Games, he actually says that fun is another word for learning in games. So it's really important that we learn as part of the game. We build new skills and we improve as players to actually have fun in the game. And that's the sense of challenge that we want in games. The next element that we have is play. Now, play relates to, for example, what Roger Caillois, a philosopher, calls 4 different types of play. He talks about agon, which is competitive play, alia, which is chance-based play, mimicry, which is make-believe play, and illings, which is vertigo play. So among those 4 different types of play, when you're building an interactive application, when you're building a product, something that's supposed to be playful, and oftentimes we want products that are playful, then you're trying to build something that is competitive. Maybe it has a competitive aspect, or you're building something that has an element of surprise, something that shows you new followers every once in a while, something that says, oh, hello, happy birthday. If you think about recent things on Facebook, you see something, oh, look at these memories that we've created. You weren't prepared for this, but all of a sudden a video is presented to you. All of these elements of surprise really engage us in a playful way with modern applications. So it's interesting to think about that when you're doing interaction design, if you're thinking about these game design aspects. And of course, Illing's vertigo play, we haven't seen much of that yet, but recently with the GoPro and other technologies that are available, we have the way of capturing really high velocity moments and things that really engage us. So there is an idea there that we could maybe use that to foster what we call vertigo play. And then of course, you have to think about, is it something along the lines of play that is free and open, or is it something that is very constrained and limited by rules? Constrained and limited by rules is what Caillois calls ludus, it's rule-based play. And then we have the free play, the open play, and that is called paida, that's improvisational play. And both of these are important in the space of designing games or designing play. But it is good to know that it's not always just rule-based, but sometimes you can just have opportunities for play, just like a sandbox or a toy that you give to people. Next, we have premise. Premise is also quite important in game design. It's something that comes from storytelling and from narrative. We have to think about a time, a place, a main character, an objective, an action that propels the story forward. All of these things are important to really start to get going with an idea, with a narrative that you're propelling forward in your game. Not all games need to have narrative, but usually all games have some sort of premise or a setting within which things take place. It just helps you kind of set a tone. If you think about interaction design, think about the color or the shape of something that you're designing, whether or not it has a certain look and feel, whether or not you're engaging people by telling a story, what the app's supposed to be. Is the app supposed to be something that lets you take pictures, or is it something that lets you tell a story? Is it something that helps you manipulate the news? Whatever it is that you're building and that you're engaging with usually has a story to tell and something that engages people in different ways. And it makes a formal system of a game playable for the users. Then we have characters. Characters are quite important in storytelling. They're also quite important in games. We've got something like characters that invoke empathy. And empathy is usually a good thing because you want to feel empathic with the main characters in your game. You have the protagonist, you have the antagonist. So usually the main character that drives the story forward, that's the protagonist. Or the antagonist, which is the main enemy, somebody that's in the way of the protagonist achieving the goal. And then you can characterize those different types of characters by looking at their wants, their needs, their hopes, and their fears. And that helps you build either very round characters, where you've characterized everything, or very flat characters, where it's all open to interpretation, and you can build your own view of the character. Think about something like Gordon Freeman from Half-Life 2, where really the face of the character wasn't defined by the developer at first, and later on in marketing they added something for the box shot of the game, but it wasn't actually thought of as something that was needed by the game developer. They wanted everyone to be Gordon Freeman. Everyone wanted to experience the way the game felt around them. So you got those different types of characters. You've got agency versus empathy, something that you do a lot yourself or something that you read about and you don't interact with as much. And then finally, we've got story. Story as a dramatic element is also very important for building engaging games and building engaging narratives. The uncertain outcome that we have in video games fosters that kind of engagement. And stories, can work towards that uncertain outcome. They can have story points that you want to get to. You want to understand more about how the characters interact, how the story progresses. Or you want to branch into a narrative. You want to follow a side story and you really want to understand how some of those things are going on. And you don't necessarily want to explore the main story that somebody gave to you. So story has some sort of flexibility in the game space that's different from classic literature and other novels. It allows you to tell different stories and look at different perspectives that people can interact with the application. So this was it, a short introduction into game design, looking at the formal elements and the dramatic elements of games. I hope this was useful for your practice as interaction designers, and I thank you very much for your attention. I'm Leonard Nacke from the University of Waterloo. Thank you very much.